Welcome dear students, we are on the CEC Gurukul lecture and we are in the series of electronic circuits. Up to now we have discussed many electronic gadgets which are used in development of the electronic circuits. Now in today's lecture we will discuss that how these electronic circuits are connected with each other or on the PCB. So, it must be the one world must be in your mind that how we connect these electronic components on the circuit, and we will make a complete circuit by connecting all the electronic gadgets. So, one of this process to connect is the soldering. Soldering is the process where we join the two or more type of metal through melting solders. Means when we are developing a PCB or we connect electronic circuit, we connect the various components, and various components contain the semiconductor material, and these semiconductor materials are connected to each other but through the soldering. So, what was the soldering? Soldering is a process that joins the two or more type of metals through melting solders. The first soldering iron was developed in 1896 by Richard and August. It was called the first electric heating apparatus. So, soldering is commonly used in the electronic components to connect each other, as it is simple and safe for joining the sensitive materials also. Likewise, the process is also known for metal working, plumbing, roofing and joining the wires. Now, let us discuss about this soldering in detail, and how many types of soldering we have, how we can solder the materials on the basis of their metals. So, what is soldering? Soldering is uses as a filler metal with a low melting point. That metal is known as the solder. To join the metal surfaces, the solder is usually made of the alloy, which consisting of the tin and lead, and their melting points are 235 degrees centigrade and 350 degrees centigrade respectively, and they are easily melt, and because of that they are used to connect the various electronic components. But when the tin and leads are mixed, then the melting point of the mixture is reduced to 183, and that alloy is melted by using the hot iron at about 316 degree centigrade. So, soldering basically uses the uses as a filler metal to connect the various electronic devices. Now, as a solder cools, it creates a strong electric and mechanical bond between the metal surfaces, and this bond allows the metal part to achieve the electrical contact while it is held in place. So, a particular point when we connect the electrical contact with the material with the two components, then we use this solder just to bound these two components. So, lead free solders are increasingly used nowadays as an alternative to environmentally harmful lead based solders due to the regulation. So, sometimes we use the lead free solders to in the preparation of the electronic circuit. The first step in the soldering, what we do is to wear the protective gears in the well ventilated area. So, next the soldering iron should be preheated so that the easily connection can be done. For cleaning the soldering tip, we can use the wet sponge. We have a small tip on the soldering iron, and then we just it must be clean by the wet sponge. And other which is the important part in doing the soldering, we use is residue on the workpiece surface should be wiped off so that the clean connection can be done. After finishing the preparation, now the heat the base metal to a working temperature using the hot iron. Doing it will help prevent the thermal shock actively the solder, and overall improve the quality of the joint as we joining the two component, the quality will be improved if we clean the tip. So a good indicator that the metals are well heated is when the molten solder freely flows into the joint. So filler material solidifies as it cools down, and it will make the connection between the two components when it will be solidified, and making the best time for the inspection just to check that the connection will be on the proper in the proper manner or not. Sometimes we can do the desoldering also. Now how we can desoldering? uh, Time to time we require the desoldering where the components not working and we need to replace, so we use the desoldering. Then when these components are mechanically held in place with the solder, a process is called the desoldering, which removes the material cleaningly and safely from the surface without damaging the electronic component. So desoldering is also done just to replace the component which are not working. So for desoldering, what we do, what we just take these component replaced or removed from the surface, and that first we remove the material through which we are doing, which we have done the soldering. Cleaningly that material will be removed and safely, then it will be desoldered and it will remove the damaged component by using the desoldering. A soldering iron is also required for the desoldering. So a soldering iron or a heat gun can be utilized to melt the solder, that material through which we are doing a soldering. So just to remove the solder, we use the heat gun to melt that solder and allowing to safely remove any soldered component without damaging the actual component. So to remove the liquid solder, we can use the desoldering pump as a vacuum or soldering wick to absorb the molten solder. So alternatively, we can resort to an aggressively method using the compressed air that can blow off the liquid solder. So now again we are saying that we connect the two components. So in the welding we also do. So how the soldering and welding are different to each other. While soldering and welding, both the process join the two pieces of the metal and allow together, we join the two metals through the soldering or the welding. So there are some key difference in how the metals are joined through the soldering and through the welding. So the soldering uses melted filler metals to bond heated based material, and it works at a lower temperature. But the welding requires the preheated the base material to create an effective joint. It means in the soldering we not require the heated surface or the preheated the base material. In the soldering, just at the low temperature we can do this soldering, but in the welding we require the high temperature. Moreover, we require the preheated base material to create an effective joint. In the welding, it runs at a higher temperature to melt both the filler materials and the workpiece together, and it results in stronger bond with the some changes to the mechanical properties of the metal from the heated and the cooling, but it is not done in the soldering. So what metal we use in the soldering? First, there are the different methods which we use in the soldering. Soldering works well with the following base materials. What are these? Gold, silver, iron, brass, copper, aluminum, steel and titanium. These are the metals generally used for the solderings. What are the metals? While some of these metals can easily be soft soldered, and harder metals may require filler materials with a higher melting point to be joined. So both the types, soft solders is also there and the hard metals are also soldered there, but for this we require the filler material. And soldering tools, what we use for the soldering, the first component we use for the soldering is the soldering iron, and this is a hand tool and that heat the solder about its melting temperature, and it is the size vary as according to the requirement, which have a great different applications as per the requirement, and the tip of the iron has different types and the size and the shape that suits the variety of the equipments which we are developing. So soldering irons tip are of various types, are of the various size and various textures. So for the use for the components connection, and next which is important is the soldering gun. Next tool is the soldering gun, and that employ when the higher temperature require more power, then we use the soldering gun. A soldering gun heats quicker and offers better flexibility as it can be operated in confined spaces and heavily electrical connections and the metal work. Next important is the soldering stations. Soldering stations are the multi-purpose devices that have every covered for the minor projects, and that is made durable than regular soldering irons due to them being equipped with sensors, fuses, ulcers and the temperature regulations, and these stations can be used in a multiple manner, and again we can add and remove the component on this soldering stations. And solders, what are the solder, that is the important in the soldering process. Then what is this solder? Solder is available in solder, as we discussed earlier, the solder is a material that connect the two devices. So and that solder is available in the various form. What are these forms? Solder wire is the first type of solders. It is in the form of the wire, so that is called the solder wire, and is available in various combination of the alloys in the various diameter ranging from 0.2 to 1.5 millimeter. So these wires are used to connect the devices, and the wires according to the requirement, the combination of alloys are used in development of the solder wire, and it is basically used in the hand soldering. Second type of solder form is the solder bar. What is the solder bar? Solder bar are the form of the bar which is of the size of 0.5 to 1 kilogram, and basically it is used in the wave and dip soldering. And there are the various type of the soldering process that we will discuss later, but now we are discussing the various tools which are used in the soldering. The soldering and the primary tool which is the solder, and it is of the many types: solder wire, solder bar, now the solder preforms. What are these solder preforms? These are the pre-defined shaped and size solders, and they can be circular, triangle, rectangular and square or any of the other shape which are used. Next is the solder paste, that is also important. The soldering in the paste form is also available, and it is used as a reflow and the hot air soldering. What is the solder balls? Solder balls are also available, and these solder balls in the form of the tiny balls in the size ranging from 18 to 30 mil, and then these are used in the BGA or the ball grid arrow, where we are used to connect the devices, and most of the tiny and the slim gadgets have the BGA. Next, solder is the life and the blood of any PCB. That is very important. Because of that, because of this solder, we can connect the various devices. The quality of wire, paste and bar used during the soldering process, which decides the life and the performance of the circuit board. So for choosing this solder, different alloys are available, but the real one are those that are aortic, and that alloys is one that melt exactly at the temperature of 183 degree Celsius. So an alloy of the tin and lead having the ratio of 63 by 37, and hence it is called the aortic soldiers. And alloys that are not will not be changed the solid to liquid, which is at the 183 degree Celsius. And other type of the solders are lead based solders that are most commonly used. Most solder projects are typically performed using the lead solder, which consisting of 60 to 40 tin to lead ratio, and these solders melting point a 180 to 190 degree, and is usually the best choice for soldering the electrical connections. Next solder is the lead free solder, that is also for which is environmentally friendly. So sometimes we use the lead free solders. What are these lead free solder? As a way of the mitigate the use of the harmful elements, then we use the lead free solders, and these usually come as a solder wire and are composed of the metal with a high melting point like tin, copper, bismuth, silver, brass, indium and the antimony. So these are the lead free solder. Next is the flux core solder. What are these flux core solder? These filler metals come as a paste or soldering wires that contain a flux solder core. The flux releases a protective layer around the workpiece at it consumed, which achieves cleaner electronic connections and better wetting properties. Next is the flux, that is also two types. First is rosin flux and second is the acid flux. That is the alternative of the passive flux and uses the electronic as it leaves a residue that doesn't lead to corrosion. So there we use the rosin flux. But in the acid flux solders, it contains the aggressive properties which are effective in removing the oxides of the metal surface. So the leads to stronger and cleaner metal joints compared to the roses. The type of flux can be broken down into the two groups, that is the non-clean flux and second is the water soluble flux. In the non-clean flux is made with the natural resins or other synthetic materials and require the no post cleanup, while in the water soluble flux which contains the water soluble resins, and that is easily removed by rinsing. So sometimes we use the resins for the water collection. Now what are the heating method? These are also the component of the soldering. What is this heating method? Heating methods, sometimes we use the simple soldering iron. So while concept of soldering is fairly simple, there are the different heating methods that depends on the application where we are using it. So primitive method involves a fire heating element through the butane, and but these has now evolved into the more advanced technique. Nowadays we use the laser, commonly used in the delicate electronics. We use the laser of the 30 to 50 watts can accurately create a soldered joint while preventing heat in the surrounding area. So we use the laser for the sensitive connection, and it is commonly used on the circuit boards where the components are compact. Then for the precise connection we use the laser for the heating for the connection. Next type of heating method is the induction. Then when the copper coils induce heat to the solder by using an oscillating high frequency alternating current. So induction allows for an even application of the thermal energy to the heat solder. So being a great application of the cylinders and the pipes, minimizing holes and maintaining the uniformity, we use the induction. Next is the resistance. So, in heating we use the resistance by applying the electric current to the solder and soldering iron. Now, heat is generated in a small space and it dissipates quickly and reducing the risk of the damaging the components. So we use the resistance. Next is the infrared. Sometimes infrared light is used for heat transfer and for the connection. So the infrared light is a mode of the heat transfer to the targeted area. It only takes a few seconds and reducing the heat exposure time of the surrounding area. So at a particular area we use the infrared radiation, infrared light, and that light will generate a heat and that will use for the heating connection. Now, what type of soldering we are having? We are having the 3 soldering types and that can be based upon its varying temperature, and these are used for the different joint strength. So, there the 3 soldering types that are used at a varying temperature levels that result in the different joint strengths. Number 1 is the soft soldering, that is the temperature limit of this soldering is 90 degree to 450 centigrade. So, the solder melts allow containing the lead that has a low melting point with a lower melting point, and this soldering type minimizes the thermal stress wherein the base metal are the subject. Next type of soldering is the hard soldering, that is above the 450 degrees centigrade. So for this brass and silver are usually hard soldered, and with the use of the flame and blowtorch, and we use this to melt the filler materials, to melt the solder. So hard soldering has better mechanical strength than the soft soldering, which applies to crafting the jewelry and the some other machine operation where it is required. Next type of soldering is the brazing. Now brazing uses the metals with a much higher melting point as compared to the hard and soft, that must be above the 450 degrees Celsius. So it produces the strongest result, which is perfect for the metal repairs and for the pipe joining. And now the process how we solder the electronic components, what materials we use and what is the process. So first we discuss the material and the equipment which is used in the soldering the electronic components. So a soldering iron we require, a soldering iron used to heat to connecting the solders. For electronic circuits we use the 25 to 40 watt soldering iron. Now second important point is a high wattage soldering irons are not necessarily hotter. If we take the high voltage, so it is not necessary that we require the high iron voltage. So a 40-watt soldering iron makes joint faster than a 50-watt soldering does. So soldering iron can be purchased at a hardware store and a most large development stores. Now you see there is a tip. Through this tip you see, and here the solder material are used, and now you see that this is a wire type of the solder, that material used with the soldering tip. This is a soldering tip as you are seeing on the screen, and that is connected the two devices. You see there how much small the device we have, and these are the various type of the soldering we are used in soldering the devices. And in this manner the connections can be done. So we will continue with this lecture. Thank you very much.